Hi there, this is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, and welcome to another random review. Today isn't a film review, it's a television review, and seeing I like to keep up to date, I'm going to review Season 1 of Monty Python's Flying Circus from 1969, because I like to keep up with current TV. This is... kind of showed that I got the network box set, which is a bit of a beast, last year, and I'm just going to go through it season by season. I do love Monty Python, but obviously, as we'll see, Monty Python is flawed. Not everything has aged well, but as far as their influence, I mean, people are still being inspired by their work. So each of the seasons in this box set, I think there are standard releases now by Network, but each season, which is quite impressive, comes with a rather large, almost 200-page book, and there's a lot of reading in it, as viewer notes. So the season 1 viewer notes is pretty much the period of 1969, just before, well, the first chapter is 1939 to 1969, as they were all born, and up to getting the first season and what the reaction was to the first season. So I mean, these books are literally books. I mean, obviously they all came from different backgrounds and they all came together at university, and then through they were working on various television programs like the Frost Report or Do Not Adjust Your Set, and then the discs just come in these sleeves. So I think the standard editions will just have these as opposed to the huge tome viewing guides. But the first thing I should say, apart from the box feels really nice, is the picture quality is amazing. For those of us who watched Monty Python on television, had copies of them recorded illegally off the television on VHS, bought them on VHS, bought them on DVD, the picture quality in these Blu-rays is amazing. It's not just the studio stuff, which you expect to be cleaned up and better. It's the VT stuff, the stuff that was shot in film on location is just pristine. It's the best it's ever looked. So if you've never bought Monty Python before, the Blu-ray I would highly recommend. I mean, it's up there with the best Blu-rays that I've ever seen as far as cleaning up, because some of the Monty Python, the film work on location was pretty dark, pretty grimy, but they've cleaned it up tremendously, and you can tell a lot of work has went into this set. So I would say, I know Monty Python are famous for kind of re-releasing stuff and rehashing stuff. I mean, they've made so much money based on just like 4 series of television and a few films, and there's so much stuff that's been re-released. But this set, for the prints of the footage, it's absolutely exquisite. So that would be the first thing I would say. I will be using my notes, and I apologise, but I'm going to go through each episode and try and do a fair assessment of it. Obviously comedy is even more subjective than drama or whatever, and Monty Python isn't for everybody. There's obviously stuff that hasn't aged well, stuff they just couldn't get away with nowadays, as far as, you know, members dressing as American Indians and blacking up and stuff like that, and some of the racial language, or referring to homosexuals, that kind of language and stuff hasn't aged that well. But it's of its time. Obviously, they were highly influenced by the Goon Show and Spike Milligan, as far as his Q series, as far as the sketch show. They would have running characters, they would be constantly breaking the fourth wall. Sketches would just end because they couldn't really think of a punchline. It's funny watching the first season because the audience misses so much stuff or doesn't really understand what's going on, which is fair enough because, you know, I'm not really sure how many people saw Spike Milligan's Q, which was even more avant-garde and more experimental than Monty Python. Monty Python was still experimental and avant-garde, but managed to rein it in to some extent. Obviously, I'll talk about sometimes when they don't rein it in, to detrimental effect. So I would say not everything they do is gold. I think that would be false to suggest that. I think even the most die-hard Monty Python fan would never suggest that everything they touched was amazing. But the thing is, when Monty Python is at its best, it's just some of the best comedy ever written, in my opinion. And like I said, 50 years later, it's still being homaged. So we'll start with episode 1, even though it was supposed to be episode 2. The season was supposed to start with an episode called Sex and Violence, but they actually transmitted it in 1969 with Wither Canada. So obviously we have the start of the It's Man, Michael Palin, who goes through his clothes in tatters, goes through various scenarios just to walk up to the screen and say "It's," and then the titles. Bizarrely, not bizarrely, but John Cleese wouldn't do the funny Monty Python's Flying Circus until later in season 1. It's also interesting that the famous John Cleese sitting in various locations and saying, "and now for something completely different," again, doesn't happen until later in the season. Actually, Eric Idle and Michael Palin are the first ones to actually say it. So we start with famous deaths, introduced by Mozart. And then we have Italian classes, where Terry Jones is teaching Italian to a bunch of Italians. We have Whizzle Butter, which plays on the idea of the comparison advertising. So, you know, housewives can't tell the difference between Whizzle Butter and a dead crab. We have It's the Arts, with Sir Edward Ross, where John Cleese is interviewing Graham Chapman in a very serious arts programme, but gets more and more familiar with his name, which is highly amusing. Then we have Two Sheds Jackson, who's a composer, but Eric Idle, the interviewer, is more concerned with his nickname, which again plays on the idea of we're more interested in the trivia sometimes involved with artists and the gossip involved with artists rather than their work. And then we have one of the first and best set piece. You know, obviously sometimes Monty Python sketches would be like a minute long, other times they did longer, kind of 10-minute ones or 15-minute ones, sometimes some that almost took a whole episode, with varying degrees of success. But this is the funniest joke in the world, which is one of their best. And this is the idea that somebody creates the funniest joke in the world and it's deadly, and then that gets taken by the army to be used against the Germans in World War II. And again, it's just a really good concept, and it's really done very well. There's an ongoing kind of joke or ongoing theme in this one about pigs and shooting flying pigs. And then the episode ends with one of their examples of something that doesn't quite work, and that's the idea of Picasso doing a painting on a bike as he travels through the country, and there's a running commentary of other painters on bikes, which for me doesn't really work as well. So that's episode 1, which was episode 2, and then we get episode 2, which was episode 1, just to confuse matters, called Sex and Violence, which opens with the wonderful Clever Sheep sketch, which leads on to the idea if sheep could fly, could we make them into planes, where Michael Palin and John Cleese are speaking French, and describing how a sheep could be converted into a plane, which is very good. We then have the Man with the Three Buttocks. We then have a man with musical mice. Again, something that might not be passed nowadays, where he hits his mice with hammers and they let out a specific squeak, which is in tune, which is very funny. Then we have Marriage Counsellor. Again, another character called Arthur. There's lots of characters in Monty Python called Arthur, which I believe was Graham Chapman's middle name. And then we have found footage of Victoria and William Gladstone messing about. Lots of Laurel and Hardy physical comedy. And then for me, we have the first classic scene or classic sketch of Monty Python. And it's the one where Eric Idle, in a suit, goes back to London from Barnsley. Graham Chapman sounds like he's from Yorkshire, but he's the playwright and Eric Idle is the miner. So they just swap personas, and it's absolutely wonderfully written about how Eric Idle, left because London wasn't good enough for him. He went to be a miner, whereas Graham Chapman, with his Yorkshire accent, he's the playwright. They talk about writer's cramp. Eric Idle complains that his mother's tired out after meeting all these celebrities and going to gala luncheons. Graham Chapman's like, there's nothing wrong with gala luncheons. Again, it's just a perfect example of Monty Python turning concepts on their head. Again, people have done it later, but Monty Python were kind of, the template and the blueprint for lots of things, and that's why they still endure 50 odd years later. It's just a wonderful sketch, and like I say, for me, it's one of their first best sketches. And then we have an episode of Epilogue, where again it's the discussion on the existence of God, but instead of having a conversation, we have a writer and a cardinal who just get into a ring and have a wrestling match. We then have one of Gilliam's best animations, the man eating pram. Again, with Gilliam's animations, some of them work better than others. Some of them are classics, other ones aren't. Again, when Monty Python doesn't really work, it's generally something that goes on too long. But again, it's all subjective. And then we end with, again, another wonderful bit on the mouse problem and of how the secret clubs where men dress as mice. Again, this is a satire on anything you pretty much like, cross-dressing or anything. But again, Monty Python just take it to absurd levels, but it's actually talking about, serious things. Again, there's wonderful moments where, they're talking to somebody anonymously, but of course his real name is this, and it's that pastiche of, you know, Panorama and 60 Minutes of this po-faced investigative style, this kind of secret filming when they're all dressed as mice and stuff like that, which is highly amusing. Again, in episode 2 there's a running theme of sheep. We had pigs in episode 1, this one's got a running theme of sheep. In episode 3, I'll try and speed this up because there is 13 episodes, so you'll be here all day. Episode 3, it starts off in the courtroom, and there's various kind of sketches. There's a beautiful speech that Eric Idle gives about freedom, then the judge says it's just a bloody parking offence. Then John Cleese turns up with obviously no knowledge of what the case is and brings forth all these ridiculous witnesses, including, in typical Monty Python style, a witness in a coffin, and Cardinal Richelieu, and then Inspector Dim of the Yard turns up, and there's a wonderful little song. And then that moves on to an on-location film of a world where everybody's Superman, but when somebody has a flat tire on their bicycle, one of the Supermen turns into Bicycle Repairman, and of course all the Supermen are really impressed by Bicycle Repairman, played by Michael Palin. And again, that's just a wonderful pastiche of the whole superhero thing. And in a world of superheroes, you still need people who do normal jobs. And to the superheroes, they're heroes. Next we have Story Time with Eric Idle, which is an amusing little thing as all the stories turn out to be X-rated. And then we have, for me, the second classic scene of the series, and that's the restaurant sketch, which you probably all know about if you're Monty Python fans, the case of the dirty fork, and how that just escalates into this wonderful, disastrous thing with a wonderful last line. Then we have another short classic thing about the seduction of milkmen by poor old Carol Cleveland, who had to dress in underwear for most of the series, of trapping milkmen, seducing them and taking them up to the room when he opens it, and it's full of other milkmen in various ages, including a skeletal milkman who's just been trapped. It's just a wonderful idea. There's so much when you re-watch it that you can tell the League of Gentlemen, for example, were inspired by. And then finally we have another classic sketch. It's the Nudge Nudge sketch with Eric Idle and Terry Jones, about a guy constantly badgering this person in a pub about what it's like to sleep with women. And then we have episode 4, which, again, some of these episodes are a bit patchy, but episode 4 has the wonderful Terry Jones trying to change on the seaside, and he is caught out in various places and he ends up on stage doing a striptease. Then we have another classic scene of the self-defense from Fruit, with John Cleese doing one of his more maniacal authority figures. Because it's how to defend yourself against somebody coming at you with a banana or a handful of loganberries. This episode's called Owl Stretching Time, which I believe is one of the alternate titles for the show. And then we have this elongated scene in a bookshop involving spies and dentists, which again just gets more and more ridiculous, and I do feel it just runs out of steam at the end, so they just end it. Then we have episode 5, which starts with, again, a kind of longer scene of Confuse a Cat, which must have been an influence on the Goodies. And then we have somebody trying to smuggle watches into the country which again is quite amusing. And then we have a job interview with ridiculous questions, which obviously plays on the whole idea of job interviews. And we're now in a world that interviews have become more and more absurd and ridiculous. And then we finish with Eric Idle pretending to be a burglar, but he's actually just an encyclopedia salesman. So the next episode again starts with one of my favourite ones. It's another episode of It's the Arts, but it's about a composer with a really long name, which again was probably a Cleese and Chapman, because they're the ones that do all the kind of wordplay. And this one is just so funny. I mean, it's a simple joke. It's a composer with a really long name, but of course every time they mention it, they have to say the whole name. The interview people, of course, every time they mention it, they have to say a long name. Terry Jones plays an old relative of him, and of course he has to say the name, but by the time he actually says it, he ends up dying. It's a simple joke, but it's still funny. And then we have a pastiche of bank robbers, organising a robbery of a jewellery store, but they're actually going to pay for the watch. And one of them complains because they're not actually doing anything illegal. And then Eric Idle's character realises he's left the car on a parking meter and it's overdue. Then that sprouts Michael Palin, who's the leader of the gang, into this outlandish escape plan. And then we have one of their film ones of the dull life of a stockbroker, played by Michael Palin, and of course all this stuff that's not dull is going on around him, but he's completely oblivious to it. We have a brief appearance of a Scotsman on a horse, played by John Cleese. And then we have movie ideas by a very domineering mogul in a room full of writers, which is kind of okay. But a great performance with Graham Chapman. Then we have episode 7, which arguably is probably my least favourite episode in the season. It starts with Eric Idle as a camel spotter, but obviously he's just a train spotter. And then we have a very long film episode of a science fiction idea about English people being turned into Scotsmen by alien blancmanges in an attempt to win Wimbledon, because Scotland is famous for being the worst tennis nation. Not so much now with Andy Murray. It goes on way too long, and it's really not that funny, but it lasts for pretty much the whole episode. So let's go on to episode 8, entitled Full Frontal Nudity, which starts with Vox Pops, which again was something that Monty Python did a lot of, asking the man in the street. First one's not a man, the other one's sitting on the roof, so he's not in the street. Which again, many series has done since. There's a nice one with Leaving the Army, which turns into the famous Vercotti brothers trying to blackmail Graham Chapman's general into a protection racket. Again, Graham Chapman's character runs through the episode stopping sketches because they're too silly. There's a ridiculous sketch about bed salesmen, and of course one of them exaggerates figures by 10, another one exaggerates them by half. You can't say mattress to one of them. Again, it's another example of one of the more absurd Python sketches. And then there's a funny one about hermits, but of course they're actually quite social, which Graham Chapman's general interrupts for being too silly. But this episode contains another classic Python sketch, the parrot sketch, which once it's actually ran out of steam, it does add bits onto it, which are obviously never performed live because they're not actually that good. but the parrot sketch itself is seminal. Not one of my favourite Python sketches, but it is one of their most or arguably their most famous sketch. And then we have the wonderful but short Flasher film, which is Terry Jones running up to people and opening his jacket, and they're shocked. Then of course he turns around and he's just got a card with Boo, which is just, it shouldn't be funny, but it's just funny. It's so simple, but it's funny, because again we're playing on expectations that he doesn't have anything under his coat. And then this episode finishes with another classic film, which is Hell's Grannies. Again, the idea of gangs of old women causing trouble and threatening the young people, which is just, again, a wonderful twist on what we expect. Then we have episode 9, which opens up with one of my favourite, even though it really shouldn't be, which is Llamas, which is just rather strange and unusual song about llamas and their characteristics by John Cleese. That's wonderful. And then we have the mountaineering sketch, where John Cleese is going to lead a party to both peaks of Kilimanjaro, and Eric Idle is the bemused person who's come for the job. It's just wonderful. And then that goes into another classic scene of Michael Palin as a hairdresser, terrified to cut Terry Jones's hair, which leads into I never wanted to be a barber, I always wanted to be a lumberjack, which leads into one of their most famous songs about cross-dressing. And then Professor Gumby makes his first appearance on the show. And then it ends with not one of my favourite sketches, as Graham Chapman's hoping to have a quiet night in with Carol Cleveland, and then all these grotesque characters turn up. It's almost like a Harold Pinter play turned up to grotesque levels. You know, lots of Hieronymus Bosch characters turn up, and it is fairly awful. Again, that's probably the intent. I'm not sure how they got away with it. Episode 10 starts with John Cleese trying to rob a bank, but the problem is the bank's actually a lingerie shop. And then we have another classic sketch of the vocational guidance counsellor and Michael Palin playing one of his meek chartered accountant characters who wants to become a lion tamer, but he doesn't quite realise what a lion actually is. And that's just a wonderful, wonderful sketch. And then another VT episode with Luigi Forcotti again, up to his old tricks, with Terry Jones as a man who wants to jump the English Channel, and various bizarre stunts like digging his way to Java and things like that. And then we end up with a gorilla librarian, which again I think was an influence on Not the 9 O'Clock News with their famous gorilla sketch. As a library who prefers taking on wild animals as librarians to keep order. So that episode is a bit hit and miss, but it does have the lion taming sketch, which is fantastic. Episode 11, again, isn't one of the best. It starts with a kind of Agatha Christie mystery, which escalates, and even the show itself leaves it for a while and then comes back, as they say, we'll come back to it if something interesting happens. Then there's a running thing going through of undertakers, and then it ends with, well, it doesn't end with, but it features the classic reenacting of Pearl Harbor by the Batley Town Guilds Women's Guild, which again shouldn't be funny, but it is. But again, episode 11's not the best episode in the series. And then we have episode 12, which starts with the classic people falling out the window, and Eric Idle and John Cleese putting bets on who's next, because it's a board meeting and people are jumping out. And then it goes to the North Minehead by-election, where Mr. Hilter and his friends are trying to gain power in the northeast, which is very funny. And then we have a funny little sketch involving policemen, but again, one of them can only hear a really high register, one of them can only hear a really low register, one of them you have to speak really quickly, one of them you have to stick. It's absurdist, but it's rather funny. And then we have one of their classic kind of film sketches, which is the Upper Class Twit of the Year competition, which is just wonderful. Again, kind of hit and miss episode. Most of the episodes are hit and miss, to be honest. And then we have the last episode of the season, which starts with the vegetarian restaurant sketch, which again is kind of hit and miss, and they kind of give up on it, and there's lots of fourth wall breaking. But then we have a brief appearance of Albatross with John Cleese, which is wonderful. The picking up of a policeman, when Michael Palin goes up to John Cleese, policeman, and says his wallet's been stolen. But it's just an excuse to ask him back to his house, which were 1969. We have historical impersonations, which instead of people impersonating famous people, it's historical characters impersonating celebrities. And then we have an investigation into the police using magic and wands, which is amusing. And then we have, it finishes with a guy having an operation and finds out that he's actually got hippies living inside him, which again doesn't quite work and hasn't aged well, but it's fun. So I think if you haven't been bored by that rundown of episode by episode, I think you can kind of get the sense of it is scattershot, it is hit and miss, but when it hits, it's wonderful. And again, I think Monty Python fans know that you kind of let the other stuff fall away that isn't quite as good. I mean, I think John Cleese said at one point, I know he almost looks back on it not too fondly and says there's only about 20% of it that's actually good. I would maybe raise that to maybe 40%, but it's certainly not all comedy gold like other series of the past, perhaps. But because it is, when they are at their best, it is pure gold, I think we kind of forgive the other stuff. But certainly, like I said earlier, the picture quality in this Blu-ray release is amazing. So again, if you've never bought Monty Python, again, like I said, I think these are getting individually released, probably without the tome. It's well worth picking up because the picture quality is just stunning. So I hope you enjoyed that. I hope it wasn't too much of a chore for you watching that as I attempt to explain episode by episode. But it's just refreshing to see them look so good. So hopefully I'll be doing it seasons 2, 3 and 4 at some point. So let me know what you think of Monty Python's Flying Circus. Are they influential and wonderful despite their flaws, or do you think they're overrated and well past their sell-by date? Let me know in the comments below, and hopefully you'll join me for future seasons. This is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, saying goodbye.